WNYC Studios is supported by Odoo. When you buy business software from lots of vendors, the costs add up and it gets complicated and confusing. Odoo solves this. It's a single company that sells a suite of enterprise apps that handles everything from accounting to inventory to sales. Odoo is all connected on a single platform in a simple and affordable way. You can save money without missing out on the features you need. Check out Odoo at odoo.com. That's odoo.com.
It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. Good morning again, everyone. We'll talk now about the Trump administration continuing to use lawsuits and investigations to attack diversity, equity, or inclusion programs. We'll focus on two new developments that you may have heard the headlines about in the last few days. One, they're investigating Smith College, the private women's college in Massachusetts. They're calling it a civil rights investigation over Smith admitting a transgender student. They're investigating that as an act of sex discrimination against women. Smith started admitting trans women in 2015. And they're suing the New York Times for not promoting a white male to a deputy editor position. The suit from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission challenges the very premise of the Times' attempt to increase representation and leadership by underrepresented groups. The government says, quote, a necessary consequence of New York Times' intent to increase the percentage of non-white leaders would be a decrease in the percentage of white leaders, unquote. So we'll talk about both these cases now and the bigger tensions over how to view discrimination that they represent with Suzanne Goldberg, Columbia University law professor, co-founder of the school's Center for Gender and Sexuality Law and founder of its Gender Law Clinic back in 2006. She's also had some roles in the Biden administration as an advisor to the Undersecretary of State for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and to the Special State Department envoy to advance the human rights of LGBTQ plus persons. She also had been the acting Assistant Secretary in the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Professor Goldberg, thanks for joining us. Welcome to WNYC.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Let's take the Smith College investigation first. I believe this is coming from the exact office that you used to work in, the Education Department's Office of Civil Rights. And I know you have opinions, but first, can you just explain to our listeners what kinds of civil rights violations are the Trump people considering that Smith may have committed?
So the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights announced it is opening an investigation of Smith, saying that its admission of transgender women might violate Title IX. Title IX, of course, is the federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in education programs that receive federal financial assistance. So it applies to most colleges and universities. And this is an astonishing move from an office that bears responsibility for enforcing the nation's education civil rights laws. The Senate just released a report earlier this week, the Senate Help Committee, saying that this Office for Civil Rights failed in 2025 to resolve 99% of the discrimination complaints it received last year. So racial harassment, sex harassment, restraint of kids with disabilities, resolved almost nothing, and it's throwing its resources into raising questions about over a decade-old admissions policy at Smith that arguably is not even covered by Title IX.
So they might consider it to be discrimination against women by allowing someone they consider a man to take one of the spots at a woman's college. From what I've read, this would be new ground. It's a first, investigating a school for merely admitting a transgender student, not about like unfair competition in women's sports or anything like that. So would this be new legal ground if they go through with it?
I think I would call it a new contortion of Title IX. And first, on the big picture, again, it's important to connect the dots to the administration's broad-ranging efforts to try to control admissions and other aspects of higher education institutions, whether at Harvard or Columbia or elsewhere. But specifically, Title IX, when Congress passed Title IX, it excluded admissions at private colleges on the view that it wanted to allow women's colleges and men's colleges to continue to exist. So it's a kind of extraordinary move to try now to apply Title IX to Smith's admissions. But your description of the government's premise here, which is that admissions of transgender women somehow violate the rights of other women at the school, that is what the government is saying. It's not what the students at Smith are saying. And students advocated for a policy at Smith to admit all women, and students support that policy. This complaint isn't coming from students, and the law of Title IX focuses on whether, in particular, there's a primary focus on whether students are being denied opportunities, right? Limited or denied in their educational opportunities because of sex. That's not the reports from the ground. This is coming from conservative advocacy groups and being picked up as part of the federal government's effort to, I think, smear transgender people and divert attention from really the harms to higher education today.
So let's talk about Smith's response. According to the New York Times, the college issued a statement that said it remained, quote, fully committed to its institutional values, including compliance with civil rights laws, unquote. And I'm curious how clear that language is to you as a statement that they will fight for their right to admit trans women, as opposed to they will comply with civil rights laws, however the current administration may interpret them. We know some colleges have been capitulating to anti-DEI threats, more so or less so.
To me, the response seems thoughtful, right? Colleges and universities all have their own mission. They have commitments, and they pursue those commitments consistent with federal civil rights laws. I think what the statement recognizes, or at least it's reasonable to read the statement as recognizing, is that the government is trying to take really trying to kind of cut the heart out of civil rights law, right? Education civil rights law, Title IX in particular, is focused on protecting educational opportunities free from sex discrimination for all students and really for anybody who accesses a college or university as a student or employee. And without a real complaint from anybody on the ground, any students or others, the government is coming in and saying, you have this 10-plus-year-old policy and you're wrong. And again, this is at the same time as the same agency is not doing its job in response to all of the real racial harassment, sex harassment, disability harassment cases that it's receiving. So it's really, this is in my view, a sort of a political move. The government is reaching out to its base. It's not a serious investigation of harms to students at a college or university.
On it being a political investigation, as you alleged, the Boston Globe reported that the Trump people may have been triggered by Smith giving an honorary doctorate to a transgender woman, Rachel Levine, who used to be an assistant secretary for health at the Department of Health and Human Services and led what's called the United States Public Health Service Commissioned Corps. Here is Dr. Levine speaking at a conference last year and lamenting Trump administration layoffs of public health workers.
I do want to say a few words about the challenges facing our public health workforce right now. Many dedicated public health leaders, including most of the HIV and infectious disease team who I worked with in my office of OASH at HHS, have had their positions eliminated. Many are still working for work to this day. These hard-working civil servants went to work every single day to support the health and well-being for all Americans, including those living with HIV. I want to encourage each and every one of us to thank our public health workers.
Dr. Rachel Levine, also called Admiral Levine, for her role leading the Public Health Service Commission Corps, that's a uniformed corps of public health workers. Suzanne Goldberg, Columbia gender law professor, is our guest. Professor, I guess it would be just politics if her honorary degree from Smith was the trigger. But do you have any indication that this honorary doctorate for Admiral Levine was the trigger, either just by virtue of her being trans or because she criticized the Trump administration layoffs?
So I can tell you several things from the public record. First, the administration has been going after Dr. Levine, who is, in addition to being an extraordinary public health leader, a pediatrician and sort of fundamentally, in my experience of working with her, caring, thoughtful, public health committed leader. But the administration has been going after her in a variety of insulting and offensive ways. But more focused particularly on this action against Smith. The group that filed the complaint that triggered the Department of Education's investigation, that's a group called Defending Education. And when that group filed its complaint to the Department of Education a year ago, it wrote out all of its problems with the Smith admissions policy. And as the first exhibit the first attachment, the first piece of evidence it offered to the government was a copy of a page from Smith's website announcing that Dr. Levine and 3 others had received honorary degrees, right? Not evidence of harm to any students, not evidence that a student was denied an opportunity, only a photo and an allegation of who got honorary degrees, including Dr. Levine. And then a legal official at the organization said, yes, this piqued her interest in Smith when she saw that Dr. Levine received an honorary degree. So again, this completely contorts what should be the process of protecting the civil rights of students in educational environments by saying an outside organization didn't like who got an honorary degree. They file a complaint with the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and the Department of Education contorts the law to challenge the admissions policy of Smith, a women's college, which the Department of Education in its press release also called an all-girls school. Yet another way of dismissing one of the nation's oldest and leading higher education institutions that serves women. So I think all of the pieces together raise serious and even damning questions about the motives behind this investigation.
Wow. Listeners, any thoughts or questions or stories on either of these issues? Women's colleges admitting trans women or giving any honorary degrees, or corporate goals for increasing the presence of underrepresented groups, as we're going to get to with the New York Times story and the Trump administration suing them, underrepresented because of past discrimination, comments, questions, personal experiences, or anything related for Columbia law professor and former federal civil rights official Suzanne Goldberg, 212-433. WNYC, call or text. We'll have time to get a few of you on. 212-433-9692, call or text. Before we go on to the New York Times case briefly, do you have any sense of how controversial, if at all, the transgender student admission policy is at Smith? The Times article on the investigation reminds us that when this issue first surfaced about a decade ago, some feminists feared admitting trans women would chip away at the protected status of biological women that women's college had been, that protected space. We get calls and text here from some women who say, in the name of feminism, not conservatism, they don't like opening up their spaces to people born as men. Do you have any sympathy for any women who take that position in the name of feminism, or have a sense of how much it's still an active issue at Smith or other women's colleges that admit trans students?
Yeah, I think it is important to recognize everybody's feelings, right? People have a lot of feelings about the admission, the participation of transgender people in various spaces. I think it is also important to recognize that we are all part of a common humanity, and that to sort of single out and say, well, you're not as real a person as somebody else is quite an extraordinary thing to do. And so taking all of that, I think when we look back to over 10 years ago when Smith changed its policy, there was upset, there was contention, there were, there were disagreements among students, alums, and probably some faculty and staff. Perhaps some of those still exist, but what we do know right now in 2026 is not only has the sky not fallen at Smith, but Smith is thriving, its students are thriving, its alums are supporting the school. And what we see, kind of contrary to the fear-mongering, is that the point of Smith, as the school itself says, is to educate women. And it doesn't carve out some kinds of women can be here and some kinds cannot. So again, this is, I think, when we have the government coming in to attack a women's college for its admissions policies that, again, are not even covered by Title IX, when the government comes in and makes this its primary focus and allocation of resources, what we can see is an effort to divert attention from what it's not doing, which is enforcing civil rights laws against real harms to students every single day, and to divert attention from what it is doing, which is really trying to take over admissions and other policies of leading universities in the United States. I think much to the detriment of all of us.
Here's an interesting legal question from a listener. Listener writes, without complaint from students, how do they have standing to go to court? And of course, it's just an investigation so far, but still.
Yeah, it's a great question. The Office for Civil Rights can open investigations when it receives a complaint from any member of the public. And that in itself is not a bad thing, because sometimes students or parents are afraid for themselves to bring a complaint and might want somebody else to bring it. The question changes when if this case proceeds, if this investigation proceeds and it eventually goes to federal court. But at this stage of an administrative agency investigation, the standing issue that the caller identified is not a problem.
Let's go on to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the EEOC, under Trump, suing the New York Times. This is on behalf of a white male who did not get a deputy editor position they applied for. The suit says he was discriminated against because of the Times' interest in increasing diversity in the leadership ranks. Do you accept the premise, at least, that white men might be illegally discriminated against in some instances?
So Title VII is the federal civil rights law that prohibits employment discrimination based on race, sex, and other categories, and it applies to everyone. So it applies to, regardless of race and regardless of sex, which means that anybody who believes they've been discriminated against based on a protected category like race or sex has the right to bring a complaint, right? The Supreme Court has affirmed that, civil rights groups affirm that. These are laws that protect everyone. So certainly,
yes,
a white man or anybody else can bring a complaint if they believe they've been discriminated
I mentioned
against.
in the intro that the suit seems to challenge the very premise of the Times, or really any organization's attempt to increase representation in leadership by underrepresented groups. I'm going to read this quote again from the government. It says, a necessary consequence of the New York Times' intent to increase the percentage of non-white leaders would be a decrease in the percentage of white leaders, unquote. And that seems so central to me to the whole debate over how to strive for non-discrimination in this country. The Trump side, I guess the Supreme Court, conservative majority side, reject the notion that you can take race or gender into account to make up for past discrimination that was based on those statuses. They say considering race or gender for exclusion was wrong in the past. It's wrong for inclusion today, rather than just a single standard of qualifications for the opening. I assume you disagree with that premise. Do you want to make your case as to why, if that's so?
Yeah, I mean, there are, again, so many things astonishingly wrong with the EEOC's lawsuit here. First, every time an employer hires someone else doesn't get hired. That choice does not establish race discrimination. That hiring choice against the backdrop of a commitment of an employer to be equal opportunity and to have diverse leadership does not establish race discrimination. The government suit, in effect, my view, is an effort to chill companies, to chill employers from saying we are committed to having a diverse workforce. There is nothing unlawful about employers being committed to having a diverse workforce, no matter how much this administration complains. So the legal question in the case is there evidence to show that the New York Times discriminated when it made a promotion of one person and didn't make a promotion of the person who filed the complaint, didn't promote the person who filed the complaint? A reference to a New York Times state commitment to diversity doesn't come anywhere near proving that there was discrimination in this particular instance. It's also worth noticing that this administration has spent its time in office so far trying to eliminate rules that take statistical disparities into account to show discrimination. We call that disparate impact. It says, look, we're not going to look at statistical disparities as a way of finding discrimination against people of color. And now they're saying, oh, but we are going to look at a statement of diversity goals as proof of intent to discriminate against white employees because it says the outcome is predictable. So they, in a sense, killed a legal tool when it protected people of color and are trying to use the same logic now to, in the reverse way. And so there's all that. And then if we step back even further, the New York Times has very recently been reporting on the discomfort of both current and former including fired EEOC employees who feel they've been pressed to pursue cases for the EEOC even on thin or no evidence. So that reporting, the timing of that reporting in conjunction with the timing of this lawsuit against the New York Times also, I think, raises big flags, as one of the EEOC commissioners, Kalpana Kotkal, has pointed out.
We're getting texts that say things like, the problem is that some white men believe they should not have to compete with others, black people, women, etc., for jobs, slots in universities. Another one says it's a cynical reading of the laws and seeing the gutter racism of this government. None of their arguments stand. So that kind of represents some views of our listeners that are coming in. They would argue, the Trump people, that the single standard, if genuinely applied, will lead to an evening out in the long run, while having goals for underrepresented groups will lead to a permanent kind of division of the spoils, if you want to call it that, by identity group, which is not the equal opportunity ideal. Do you disagree with the premise that if genuinely applied, the single standard approach will result in fair representation eventually?
Let me put it a different way. I think I agree with, and our civil rights laws stand for the premise that any hiring should be done free from discrimination. I do not think that an awareness of a workforce, a commitment to having a diverse workforce amounts to or is evidence of discrimination in an individual hiring setting. In fact, because of well-documented underlying issues with discrimination in specific workplaces and in society, if there's not awareness, if there's not attention to the importance of having a diverse workforce, sometimes what happens is that those underlying biases cut against the opportunities of people of color, right? That's been the long-standing problem with discrimination in this country. And the point of civil rights laws, like Title VII, was to disrupt that, to say, no, this kind of discrimination is unlawful. What I think is happening now is the Trump administration is simply trying to say, employers, we don't want you to talk about diversity. We don't want you to be responsive to the full range of needs of your employees. We want to do everything in our power to actually constrict civil rights laws to the point that they provide no meaningful protection. That's where we see them dedicating their resources, at least their remaining resources, since they have also removed many of the experienced people who were enforcing these laws prior to their arrival.
We just have 2 minutes left in the segment. Let me get one more listener on here. Tammy in Manhattan, you're on WNYC with Columbia Law Professor Suzanne Goldberg. Hi.
Hi, thanks, Brian. I identify as trans femme. Professor Goldberg, thank you. And Brian, thank you for always keeping trans issues front and center. When I read the piece in the Times about Smith College, I mean, my first thought was the administration, who has been systematically trampling trans rights over and over again, just found another end run. And so they have managed to go after withholding of hospital funds in the New York City area where I live. They have managed to eliminate any mention of trans in many libraries throughout the country. The president has even gone so far as to say he only recognizes men and women. There are no trans people. It is a figment of our imagination.
Tammy, I'm going to leave it there because we're just about out of time in this segment, but you can give us a closing thought, Professor Goldberg, to respond to Tammy or just anything on these two cases we've talked about.
Yeah, thank you, Tammy, for your comments. And here's the closing thought. This administration is using law and policy to scapegoat transgender people. And when we see it in that light, when we see this multifaceted attack from so many different directions on one small minority group of people, we have to ask ourselves what's happening. How is our system being distorted? How is our democracy being distorted, including when we see this at the state level? And what can we all do to ensure that our government doesn't further its efforts to become a machine for scapegoating, and that this kind of normalization that they're trying to achieve, whether against DEI policies or against transgender people or against immigrants and migrants for that matter, that kind of normalization that they are trying to achieve, we remind, we speak up, we focus on that. This is not normal. Democracies don't attack their members, and that is really, I think, at the end of the day, all of our responsibility to be clear about.
Columbia Law Professor Suzanne Goldberg, thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you so much.
WNYC's journalism and storytelling is heard by millions of passionate listeners. Sponsors of our programming gain our listeners' attention and their respect. Learn about how your organization can support WNYC and WNYC Studios at sponsorship.wnyc.org.